Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new series by Crownsman called Crownsman Ag. I didn't hit that quite as good as I wanted to, Gowdy. Off to a good start, but okay. I think it's fair to say hello. By the way,
hello.
I think it's fair to say that we've had, well, over the last couple of years, we actually had quite a few ag episodes, but we haven't actually focused in. And then MNP stepped up to help us get the actual Crownsman Ag show going. So this episode is brought to you by MNP. Awesome. They're going to be our first guest on the show. They're going to be talking about AgriStability, which is a program that I will not try to unpack because we brought the expert in to unpack it.
Perfect.
So, but Gowdy, we already have sponsors. So
we do.
Love
we have, so we have SolarSet. Introducing the SolarSet Fold, the new foldable frame solar system, brings power to your residential and commercial property and can be shipped worldwide. Like all SolarSet products, the SolarSet Fold comes turnkey, pre-assembled, and is easily transported and installed. You can learn more about the SolarSet Fold and their full line of amazing solar systems at solarset.com. Yeah, so that's what we got today.
Just one?
Just the one.
Oh, come on. We need, okay,
but
first episode.
That opens to, more sponsors come our way.
You are allowed to sponsor our new show.
Yes.
Okay, so Steve Funk, welcome to the first episode of Crownsman Ag. You're with, what is your position with MNP?
I'm the Director of Ag Risk Management Resources. So I oversee delivery of AgriStability and business risk management services for farms across the firm.
Okay.
So from coast to coast.
So can you give us a little snapshot of the AgriStability program? I mean, obviously the people watching on the agriculture side will know of it, but from reading through it, I think there's actually confusion even within the ag sector about it. So can you give us that sort of high level of what it is, and then we'll dive into some of the topics about it?
Yeah, AgriStability is a margin-based insurance product that has been available for a number of years in various forms. It's been called AgriStability for quite some time now. Prior to that, it was called CASE, CFIP, ADA, and then there were some provincial versions as well. So it all started back in 1995 in Alberta and 1997 in the rest of the country. And the concept of this margin-based insurance has been similar. It's evolved over those years. And currently we have a program where we're comparing the current year with a 5-year history where the high and the low are dropped. The margins that comprise the program are all come out of tax information. So if this is the tax information, the margins are a subset of the tax information because there's certain things that are allowable for AgriStability and there's certain things that are non-allowable and don't make it into those margins. So if you compare the current margin with the history, with the high and low drops averaged, and you drop by more than 30% of, relative to that average, then you get benefits at 70 cents on the dollar.
I see. So this is a program, I mean, around since 95, that's a while. There's been a lot of changes. Why has the program, has it evolved to market demand, or have they just continued to, find new ways to do it? What has sort of been the drivers for change within the program itself?
Well, the main driver is the fact that these programs are offered in 5-year terms, 5-year frameworks. And we're currently in the middle of a framework. It ends after 2022. A new one starts in 2023. So every 5 years, the programs get reconsidered. And AgriStability is one of the programs as far as ag policy goes. So at a minimum, every 5 years, there are going to be some considerations, but they also have a regular review that they do 2 years in to those 5-year cycles. And that's what you're kind of seeing right now is some things have come out of that 2-year review. Just a little over a year ago, something came out on private insurance. And more recently, something has come out removing a program feature called reference margin limiting. So that's those are the two main things that I'm going to be focusing on here today.
So are those the two are those the two main changes, or are there other changes to the program coming out?
Those are the two main changes, and they are effective for the 2020, 2021, and 2022 years, because of course, as I said, the new framework is starting for 2023.
So you'd mentioned, let's focus on the private. So did you say that private insurance they've come out and forgive the very layman questions, but I'm sure I'm not the only one that will have some of these types of questions. So what are the changes that the private insurance has made, and how is that affecting, or have they adapted because of the private insurance? Can you sort of unpack that?
Well, I think over the last number of years, in the prairie provinces in particular, we've seen the rollout of a couple of private insurance products. One is called Global Ag Risk Solutions. The other is called Just Solutions. Those are both to be used on crop farms. And I'm not going to say as a result of that, but, I think at the same time in these 5-year frameworks, the government has had one aspect of the framework. It's called agri-risk initiatives, where they encourage not-for-profit entities to experiment and design new private products. So I think the move to include private insurance in a risk management strategy is something that the government is actually encouraging by incentivizing that. GARS and Just Solutions are both profit-oriented businesses, so they weren't covered by that government initiative. But I think the government saw an opportunity that there's some good private options out there, and was there a way to incentivize people to take those private options? So when we look at the change in treatment of private insurance proceeds for AgriStability, you're going to see the incentivization that kind of results out of this change.
So could you sort of walk me through the change again, just so I have a better understanding? And again, I'm probably about 50 steps behind where you're at with it. So could you just kind of walk me through? I think you have a slide, and I kind of want to use that as a reference point.
Yeah, so the treatment of private insurance proceeds is changing for the 2020, 2021, and 2022 years. And the way these private insurance proceeds were treated before is that when you calculated the AgriStability margin and benefits, you had to include the private insurance proceeds in there. And so by doing that, that would effectively reduce the amount of AgriStability benefits that you'd otherwise receive. So now the treatment of that is changing, whereby you no longer have to include those private insurance proceeds in the calculation of your AgriStability. So effectively, you can benefit from taking private insurance and AgriStability and have the coverages stack on one another. And that's the nature of the visual, is it shows you in 2019, represented by some boxes, an amount of private insurance proceeds. It shows the same amount for 2020, and then it shows AgriStability benefits that might otherwise be received for 2019 and 2020. And then when we click on that slide, the private insurance comes down, and in 2019, it squashes the AgriStability, whereas in 2020, it sits on top. So, that's representative of the fact that, the treatment is changing so that now you can stack or double up on the coverage. It no longer claws away at your AgriStability benefit. It could have reduced or eliminated that benefit before.
Will that, now, just from the other side, as a private insurer, is there a scenario where that incentivizes them to get into the market more for more private insurance options, of course, then making it more competitive, or would that not really be applicable?
No, I think the incentivization works a couple of different ways. with this new treatment for AgriStability, it should incentivize farmers to look a little more seriously at the private options.
Right.
Because you can double up on coverage. Whereas if you're taking something like crop insurance, the effect of receiving crop insurance, is the same as the way private insurance was treated before, that the crop insurance comes into the AgriStability calculation and effectively reduces the AgriStability payment. Whereas now the private insurance is not going to do that. So it's an incentive for producers to look at those private options and to, compare those with crop insurance and see how these various products work together and, what is going to make the best combination for their farm for any given year. As far as the insurance companies go, the private insurers, I think it also does incentivize them to get into the market, because if the government is going to, support this treatment of private insurance. As I said, they had the incentive for people to create private insurance programs. It is beneficial to get into the market.
On the second point, and I'm just going to read it to make sure I get the term right, the removal of reference margin limiting. I won't even pretend to be an expert on this. Can you walk us through that and what that means?
Yeah, the reference margin limiting was a pretty controversial and poorly understood program feature. It was brought in 2013, and it changed again in 2018. But the problem was that in order to understand the way it had changed in 2018, you had to understand the way it worked in 2013. And, not too many people were able to connect those two things together or follow how that worked. So what reference margin limiting did was, as I spoke of previously, I spoke about the 5-year average where the high and low are dropped and the remaining 3 margins are averaged. Those margins consisted of allowable income minus allowable expense. And what the reference margin limiting did was it would limit the reference margin. So it would give some producers a lower number than that number that was otherwise calculated. The lower number was tied in some way to the expenses that was in that original margin, but it was pretty hard to follow how that worked. Or even whether it applied to any given farmer, depending on how keen they were on reading their assessment or understanding that. So it was a poorly understood feature. It only affected certain types of farms. It didn't affect everybody. But I think it resulted in some confusion because it did significantly limit benefits for certain farms, because of course, if your coverage level is going down, then you have to drop even more to get benefits from that. So I think that even people that weren't necessarily affected by it realized that the program had changed adversely and may have had less confidence in the program as a result, or dropped out of the program.
So if they're removing that, is that going to be, I guess maybe the word would be responsive for farmers, or just easier to navigate, or are there specific things that they now can access because of it?
Yeah, I think you hit on the 2 main points there, Jared. Removing of the reference margin limiting makes the program a lot simpler, because you no longer have this additional calculation that has to be done that a lot of producers didn't understand or understand fully to begin with. So that's one aspect of it. But the main thing is for some of them, the ones that were affected by it in the past, the program is going to become more responsive. It's going to become quite a bit more responsive. So the challenge is figuring out, are you one of those farmers that was impacted by it? And what is the impact? How beneficial is that going to be for you? And I think when people see some of the visuals that we have, or really understand that change, that they recognize that it is going to be quite beneficial.
Can we actually walk through this? You have an interesting slide here about the removal of reference margin limiting. Can you walk us through that slide a bit? Because I'll be honest, I was looking at this earlier today. This was a little bit of a last minute show, so I didn't get to quite absorb as much information as I would have liked. So if you could walk us through, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, so on this particular slide, we've got what I call the margin drop trigger point, no reference margin limit versus reference margin limit. And, the long and the short of it is that with this change, that margin drop trigger point is now 30% for everybody, all farms. Right. All farms for 2020 and future years are going to require only a 30% drop in their margin to trigger AgriStability benefits.
Right.
When they had that reference margin limiting feature in there, which is represented by the red on this particular slide here, there was an area, and you'll see two rectangles there. Think of the rectangles as a reference margin, and if you look under the red, that reference margin is split up into three sections. The top section was the area where reference margin limiting might apply to some farms. And so the government would draw a line in there somewhere. And the line could be anywhere in that box or right down to the bottom of that box. So that became the reference margin instead of the whole box.
Right.
And what it meant was that the producer then had to have even a greater drop in their current year relative to that reference margin to trigger benefits. And effectively what it amounted to for certain farms was they had to have a drop of somewhere between 30 and 51% in their margin to trigger benefits. So, without knowing the math of how that works, it already, I think, sounds pretty good that if you had to have a drop of 30 to 51% before, and now you only have to have a drop of 30, well, that could be quite advantageous for you.
Right. And it's eliminating all the confusion, right? I mean, now as a farmer, you could just essentially, as soon as you hit that point that it's triggered.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Steve, I just want to get a clarification on something, and I hope you haven't already explained it and I just misunderstood it. If a farmer qualifies today, let's say this year, now can they backdate it? Can they apply for 2016 if they also applied then, or is it in that 5-year window? How does that sort of work for backdating what they would qualify for?
So this removal of reference margin limiting is effective for the 2020, 2021, and 2022 years. It wasn't announced until early this year, so in 2021, but there's always a 1-year lag with respect to meeting some of the requirements of these programs. So in 2020, producers had to make a decision that they wanted to participate in this kind of insurance in AgriStability. So that decision is already made. They're locked into that. But for those that are locked in, this change is retroactive to 2020. For 2021, they still have an opportunity to make that decision to lock themselves into AgriStability. Normally, this decision is made, it has to be made by April 30th. Of the year, but the government has extended it, and that's part of the program change is the extension of the deadline to June 30th to participate.
Yeah, on the MNP side, I know you're here trying to educate and so I know you're not trying to make a big MNP plug, but I kind of want you to at this point, because where's MNP coming into this whole conversation? You're obviously coming on the show to let people know, but what is the avenue that people are staying up to date and knowing when these deadlines are? Is that in an annual accounting meeting? Is that their insurer updating? Is the government sending notifications? How are farmers actually staying informed?
Well, I think that would be multi-pronged, and I think you've mentioned the main things there. The government does inform people that these programs are out there. They're busy informing people right now of the changes and the potential impact, and so are we as an accounting firm. So we have a way of preparing AgriStability applications as a firm that we refer to as our full service approach, because back in the early 2000s, the government kind of abandoned the model where you had to fill out pages and pages of application that actually came to a payment at the end.
Okay.
They felt that was too complicated for producers. So they felt that by simplifying the form and just requiring little bits of information, that would simplify it for the producer. We made the decision at the time to continue calculating those benefits. And so we've become quite proficient over the years at doing that, because every time we file an application, we're estimating the benefit. And we have a means of comparison then when the government comes back with an assessment, we compare that. And you learn from it every time, right? Because it's, if there's a difference, is it our mistake? Is it the government's mistake? Or did the client provide some information that wasn't quite right? So you learn from those things, and you learn how to prepare strong submissions that are going to support your payment estimate.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure. It's honestly not my favorite thing to do, so I'm glad you're doing it to fill out some of these forms and put this stuff together. It's I've helped other people, and then I've been helped as soon as it gets too complicated. So I was just curious sort of how they're actually walking through that process. But MNP is actually doing some of that heavy lifting and filling out the more detailed version of this.
That's right. And, we also have an initiative on the go right now where we've identified our clients that aren't in AgriStability. And we're explaining these changes to them because we feel that these changes could be beneficial for a number of them. So if it's something that could potentially help them with their risk management strategy, that's something that we're going to recommend.
On the moving on to another chart that you sent through, and it said again, I'm going to read it. It's a margin drop triggered by rule of 7.5% drop of production, 7.5% drop in price, and 7.5% increase in expenses. So that must be totaling. Now, some of these looks like it's an over a 30% drop. Again, can you walk us through this chart just to give us an understanding of what we're looking at?
Yeah, so that chart was born out of something called the rule of 5%. I believe this comes originally from Dr. Danny Kleinfelter, Texas A&M University. He had this rule of 5% where he said that if a producer could find some things that would improve their production by 5%, improve their pricing that they received on the commodities by 5%, and reduce their expenses by 5%, that the impact on their bottom line would be more than 5%. In fact, it would be more than 5 plus 5 plus 5. There's kind of a multiplier effect there. Okay. And so we took that and we flipped it on its head and said, okay, well, AgriStability actually covers the same three things that he's talking about there in his rule of 5%. If you look at the margin, there's revenue in there, which is production times price. So if we could, or if a farm was impacted in an adverse way, that their production went down by a certain percentage. In this case, we're saying 7.5% instead of 5. So production is going down by 7.5, which isn't much. Price is going down by 7.5, which again isn't much. And the costs, the eligible costs that are in the margin, are going up by 7.5%. So if you analyze each of those components, it's not a really big change, on any given farm. But if the farm was adversely impacted by those 7.5% factors, production going down, price going down, costs going up, at the same time, what would be the impact on their margin drop? And so that's what we have here on this graph. And you're right that, on the right-hand side, you see certain farms there that could have up to a 211% drop from that scenario. You have other farms in the middle that are, still over that 30%. We've drawn a hard line there at 30% and shown that everybody in the groups that are listed at the bottom there's group 1, group 2, group 3. Everybody in group 2 and group 1 would have over a 30% margin drop if these things got adversely affected by 7.5%. And so the industry sectors are listed there in kind of a box that
Yep.
explains what Group 1, Group 2, Group 3 means. I think producers should take a look at that and figure out where they are, because this graph actually shows them how responsive the program can be if something simple like a 7.5% adverse effect to each of the factors happens.
Right. And I just want to loop back to that private insurance part, because if it goes beyond, I was reading through on the government site, if it goes beyond a 30% drop, it's covered up to 70% beyond the 30% drop, or how is it actually covered?
So the first 30% of the drop is the producer's responsibility. Yep. They cover that. Once you get past that 30%, so you get 70 cents on the dollar for whatever is beyond that 30% drop.
Okay. So now bringing it into sort of this real world scenario, like, as people are if they're watching this video, or maybe they watch the first few minutes and they're skipping ahead to this part, and that's, people watch these videos in different ways. So to someone who's sort of skeptical about the program, if it's a good fit for them, and sort of, how do you walk them through it? How do you sort of lay it out to say, no, this is a good program, or this isn't a good program for you?
Well, what we've done is we've boiled this down, not just to margin drop, because it is important for people to understand the margin for AgriStability, because it is a margin-based program. But we find that even when we explain margins to people, it's hard for them to relate to a 30% margin drop. That rule of 7.5, that's a step in the right direction in terms of getting them to relate to a 30% margin drop, and perhaps how little would be required to trigger that. But where we really bring it home is we've also done a similar graph, and we've focused just on the revenue drop. Because a lot of times producers get confused between margin drop and revenue drop. They think that is the same thing. And it's not. That, if they require a 30% margin drop to trigger, which every producer now does under the new rules, the revenue drop is quite different for different kinds of farms and different producers. So that same scale that we had on the bottom of that rule of 7.5 graph, I now have on a graph that is called revenue drop required to trigger AgriStability, because the revenue drop required to trigger is dependent on the cost structure that's in that margin. So the margins, again, are made up of allowable revenue minus allowable expense. The allowable expense is the direct costs of production. So anything related to capital, the interest, rent, repairs, those things are non-allowable. They're not included in the margin.
I see.
Direct costs of production are. So seed, fertilizer, and chemical for a crop farm, for example, salaries for everybody. For livestock, it would be feed and livestock purchases. So direct costs are in the margin. Now, the cost structure is, how do those costs relate to the revenue? So we have this eligible expense to eligible revenue ratio, and that's what we have on the bottom of both of these graphs plotted. It goes from 0.1 up to 1, and the farms that have a higher amount of those allowable costs relative to their revenue are on the right-hand side of the graph. They're Group 1 farms. The ones that are moderate are in the middle, they're Group 2. And the ones that have really low costs compared to their allowable revenue are on the far left, and they are Group 3. And the revenue drop required to trigger AgriStability is quite different for these different groups and different types of farms. The ones on the right-hand side, the program is much more responsive. And you can see on this kind of blue graph that, the farms on the right-hand side, the Group 1, the intensive livestock, for example, require only a single digit drop in revenue. So, a 1.5%, a 4%, a 6% drop to trigger AgriStability. Whereas some of the farms in Group 2 dairy, beef, cow, calf, crop, they might require something in the or low double digits, 12.5 to 14% or something like that.
Right.
So it's important for farms to understand where they are in here, because I think revenue drop is quite relevant to them. Most disasters, from whether it's a disaster on the farm period, or whether we're working out a disaster, whether it's a disaster for AgriStability, it's going to include a revenue drop component. So there's going to be something that affects production or price, or a combination of the two, which is going to make the revenue drop. And what we've found is that people have confused this with the margin drop, and they're very surprised when they can see how low of a revenue drop will trigger AgriStability for them.
Yeah, because I would imagine that there would be some confusion about that, because if you don't realize that even because you could. So okay, and just to kind of clarify that point, if you could not have a revenue drop, and you could have an increase but your production cost goes up to a point, eliminating certain things that you already said weren't in there, could that trigger it as well? Or does it have to be multi-component? Does it have to be a margin? Does it have to be a revenue drop and a cost? Can it be, how does that work?
Well, as I say, most disasters include some kind of revenue drop effect. They may or may not include an expense increase. Okay, if they have a revenue drop and at the same time have an expense increase, well, that helps to create the multiplier effect, if you will, in that rule of 7.5, that makes them more likely that they'll get some benefits. But often there's little or no impact on the expenses, but there could be a massive impact on the revenue going down. So sometimes the expense increase factors into it, and other times it doesn't.
So but most commonly it's about, you don't want to confuse your revenue drop with the margin, but it's generally mostly related to the revenue drop, essentially.
Yeah, you don't want to confuse the two. And I think it's very important for farmers to recognize that the revenue drop is probably less than they think, because they might have been thinking that they needed to have a 30% revenue drop, but they'd be surprised that, maybe they need less than half of that in order to trigger benefits under AgriStability. The other thing that same graph shows is it has kind of the orange line branching off and heading up to the left there. That's the way it looked under reference margin limiting. So you can see that for farms that were kind of in that moderate cost structure, the group 2, or the very low cost structure, the group 3, that they were significantly impacted by the reference margin limiting. They required a higher revenue drop before than they're going to require now. And so that really brings home the value of the program now that reference margin limiting has been removed.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so Steve, I just want to kind of swing it back over. I kind of mentioned it earlier, and I want to swing it back over to the farmers in the form of, especially if the program's been around since '95, there's been changes, maybe there's been some confusion. And where those two things combine, usually there's some level of frustration and skepticism. So can you sort of bring it home for if there is a farmer listening to this that is sort of skeptical, is this program right for them, and that sort of thing? Can you sort of walk us through that? I think that'd be quite helpful.
Yeah, so I think that there's probably, I guess, two areas where there could be some skepticism. Sometimes the skepticism comes from people that didn't have a limited reference margin before and are saying that the program never worked for them. So that, in effect, we're talking about group 1 farmers on that blue graph from before. So my response to that would have been, well, the program was already really responsive for you, or it should have been responsive with, single digit or maybe low double digit revenue drop required to trigger benefits. So if it wasn't triggering benefits for you, there must be something wrong with your calculations. So, there are certain things that we can point them to or look at in terms of their AgriStability calculations, because as I said, we do the full service approach for our clients, so we're very familiar with how those calculations work. The other thing that I would say is, a lot of times when we show people these graphs that you've seen here today, just for them to go through the various industry sectors and see, well, which industry sector am I in? Where do I fit on this graph? Does that look pretty good for me? Normally it does look pretty good. And it, for the people in group 2 and group 3, it really shows them the benefit of removing that reference margin limiting. But if they're having trouble, believing that, if you will, or they want to investigate exactly how it would fit for their farm, because these group 1, group 2, group 3 categorizations are a range, and they're never going to know exactly where they are on that range unless they actually do the calculations for their own farm. So they would have to calculate that eligible expense to eligible revenue ratio for their own farm. It's quite an involved calculation. We have some modeling that we can do for producers that are in that category. It's called Ag Risk Management Projector modeling. So the Ag Risk Management Projector, I have another visual of it here. It's a graphical tool that we use, and we take the farm's income statement, their accrued income statement, and put it on a graph. So there's a lot going on here, but, I'll explain very simply that the green, on the far left here on the graph at 100% is the revenue. And the orange and the brown stacked up in the background are the different types of costs for the farm. So there's the allowable costs in orange that are part of the AgriStability margin, and there's the non-allowable costs in brown that aren't part of the AgriStability margin, but they are part of the income statement. So we put it all on there to show what their potential profitability is. And then we carve off 10% declines in the revenue. So that's where you see the green bars going down to 0. And as we do that, losses appear in red.
Right.
And we're able to program in, either their actual or estimated AgriStability reference margin into this software, and then introduce AgriStability into the graph. So AgriStability will appear in usually pink, but sometimes there's some purple as well. It's just different aspects of the coverage. But it's a very powerful visual, because when we click on that AgriStability, it shows them exactly how many of those losses AgriStability could potentially cover. And if they have or had in the past one of these limited reference margins, we also have the ability to toggle that feature on and off. So we can show them before that limiting was removed, the AgriStability coverage might not have been very good. But once it was removed, now it climbs higher on these bars. It fills in more of the shallow losses, and it gives them overall better coverage on their risk management. So, this is one way of using this Ag Risk Management Projector tool that we've developed. The other way that we do for some of our clients is evaluating an overall risk management strategy. So then we introduce crop insurance and potentially GARS or Just Solutions into it as well, to see how these programs all work together.
Has this been, just to, sort of bring it to the people that are actually working in the industry, how do they respond? And I this is sort of outside of what we're talking about, but just when you're communicating them with, or when your people are communicating with them, is there quite a bit of confusion, or at this point now do a lot of the farmers, are they pretty up to speed on it? They've sort of got this all sorted out, or is there still a lot of confusion around it?
No, I think that there is still a lot of confusion, and I guess I touched on that at the outset when we talked about the fact that when limiting was put in, it wasn't a well understood program feature. It was pretty complicated.
Yeah. And
then in the next framework, which started a few years ago, they made a change to it, and there again. Without understanding the way it was applied at first, it was hard to understand the change. So, we're finding that, there is a lot of confusion about margin drop versus revenue drop, or whether the program is beneficial at all for certain farms.
Well, and one of the reasons I'm asking, like, we're in June, we're filming June 8th. We're probably releasing this within the next 48 hours of June 8th. The deadline has been extended to June 30th. So we're on a very slim, like, if a farmer phones you tomorrow, I mean, this is across is there any province that it's limited to? It's all of Canada, right? I just want to make
It's
sure.
all of Canada. Yeah. It's all of Canada. Deadline has been extended to June 30th to sign up.
What do they need to have in place to sign up? What are the steps? Is there if someone sees this on the 25th, do they have enough time still?
Absolutely. Now, unfortunately, I can't answer the question of what exactly you need to do to sign up succinctly, because it varies by province. So it might be the same for certain provinces like the Maritimes or Manitoba, where the federal government delivers. But for other provinces, the province is delivering AgriStability. So the rules are slightly different. And so we can't necessarily say that, you do these 3 steps and you're signed up. What we normally do is we point people to the website for their particular province or administrator. And again, I have this on a visual where we have the various provinces. And if you do a search on the name of these organizations, for example, BC Business Risk Management Branch, add the word AgriStability to it, it'll be your first or second hit. And probably right on that first page that you click on, this is an important thing, that this deadline extension, it will be on there and it'll guide them through the process. And I think they'd be surprised at how little information they actually have to provide up front. Okay. Now, they will be asked for more information later because, of course, the government has to create margins. They might need some tax information that wasn't submitted to them previously if people have been out of AgriStability for a number of years. But that comes later. The sign-up process is usually fairly simple.
What about the cost compared to like another risk management program? Is it competitive? Where does that sort of land?
Yeah, the cost is very inexpensive, and I know I'm going to get in trouble for making that statement. A lot of people, have said that the program is too expensive, but in terms of the modeling that we've done with that ag risk management projector, what we do is we factor in the 2 components of cost. So there is a government fee that needs to be paid. It's $315 for every $100,000 of margin coverage that you have. So, whatever your reference margin is, divide that by $100,000 and multiply by $315. It doesn't amount to all that much relative to the cost of other programs like crop insurance, GARS, or Just Solutions.
Okay.
And then again, there's if the producer doesn't want to complete the paperwork themselves, and they need an accountant or some kind of service provider to do it, there'd be the cost of that. But usually when you add up those 2 costs and figure that out, you're somewhere between $1 or $2 an acre if it was a crop farm. Okay. And if you consider that in light of how much would crop insurance or GARS or Just Solutions be, those are usually in the double digits per acre, and it could be 10s, 20s, 30s as opposed to $2. So, I recognize that AgriStability, may not pay out as much as some of those other programs in certain instances, but relative to the cost that you're paying, it's pretty good. Yeah. And there's another program that is kind of related to AgriStability. It's called AgriInvest. That's the one where it's a savings account, and every year the producer has the opportunity to put in an amount. It gets 100% matched by the government. It's based on 1% of their allowable net sales up to $1 million. For many producers, the cost of this AgriStability, when you add up the 2 components, could be covered by that AgriInvest matchable deposit that the government is giving them. So, it isn't very expensive, and the benefits could be substantial.
Yeah. It's, thanks for coming on the show and doing this. It's when I start some of these interviews, and this is one of the examples of it. I'm kind of trying to grasp what these programs, and I'm looking at your charts, and I was Googling it the day before, and I was on the government site, but then I didn't realize it was by each province, so I was confused about that. So it's quite interesting to see how this sort of stuff can get unpacked. Are you in? There were a lot of conversations happening. Are there a lot of people wanting to talk about it, or have they extended this because people weren't signing up? I'm just curious why it was actually extended.
Well, I think when they finally got down to the decision on whether or not they were going to remove the reference margin limiting, it was already fairly close to the deadline of April 30th. And so it was prudent for them to extend it. I know that the governments have been disappointed with the dropout rate over the last number of years. And I think that this has the potential of bringing more people back in and ensuring that their production is going to be covered by the program.
I see. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Steve, for coming on the show. It's quite exciting for us to start the ag sector. Rory has guest hosted a couple. I don't think you and Rory have met, but he has wanted to do ag for a very, very long time. So it's pretty exciting to have the support of MNP and then come on here and have a conversation like this to kick it off. Because at the end of the day, people are trying to both create security and profit for their organizations. So this is a great way to kick off Crownsman Ag. So thanks for coming on.
And thank you for the opportunity, Jared. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Gowdy, how was the first episode of... I wanted that invest program that the government matches 100%. I was so tempted to let's unpack that now. But
take it, yeah. Like in the beginning, we said we could go a couple hours, right?
Yeah, a couple hours. Yeah. I need to stop doing that to people. Someone's eventually going to tell you it's not funny.
They're all so scared.
Gowdy, we've got a new Crownsman Ag page on LinkedIn, so people can follow that. But then where else can people, we're going to load it up all on our YouTube page and everything like that.
Absolutely. So definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel because our new show, Crownsman Ag, will be on there. And we'll have more episodes to come. And that gives you an opportunity to check out the other shows, of course. But if you'd like to be part of or be on the show, contact us, info@crownsman.com. Yeah.
I feel like Clean Seed is going to be kind of mad at us. But 2 weeks ago, they were on the show.
I know.
And they're going to be like, really?
Maybe they can just come back on.
Yeah, there you go. Just come back on. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you, Steve Funk, for coming on the show. And thank you, Leanne, for getting everything set up. You've been sort of a rock star for us for getting things organized and developing new products, actually.
Absolutely, yes.
New way of promoting sponsors on the show. So we're looking forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you, everyone. We will see you on the next episode of Crownsman Ag.